So we're going to be talking about another source of data that we use to supplement the PDE data, and these are formulary files. So what is a formulary? It's basically the drugs, a list of drugs that the plan covers, but it also includes how the plan covers the drugs. So yesterday, Gia talked about tiers. Is this particular drug going to be covered as a generic preferred or a non-preferred, or is it going to be a brand drug? Is it going to go into a specialty tier? And each of these tiers might have different cost sharing associated with them. The formulary files will tell us, is the plan requiring a quantity limit or utilization management? Is step therapy required? So we'll talk all about that. There are actually a couple of different sources of formulary files. These are available as public use files. So you can actually just get them straight from CMS all the way back to 2006. There are base formulary files and excluded drugs files in the public use files. We'll talk about those. And then we're going to focus on the research identifiable files, because that's what you would get if you requested the PDE data. You could get the Riff formulary files in conjunction with those. And that's available back to 2010. And this also includes an over-the-counter drugs file, which we'll talk about. So the PUF formulary files, just to give you a heads up about those, they include the product service IDs, but they don't have any drug names. You have to do all of that linkage yourself if you want a drug name or a class associated with them. But it does give the tier level and all of those utilization management type variables. So you are able to link it with the Riff data because it provides unencrypted contract plan formulary IDs. But that's what's available on the Part D Riffs and the MBSF data. So you can just use these public use files and link them. These are available since 2005. I think I said 2006 in the previous slide. It's December of 2005 because the plan has submitted their formulary for approval by CMS. So that's the formulary that's going to be used starting in 2006. And then you can also get them. You can get the formulary files monthly or quarterly, because plan formularies can change, and we'll talk more about that later. There is a fee for the older files. It's not a large fee, but it kind of covers the cost of delivery. But you can, starting in 2019, get the files as a free download from the CMS website. So look into that if you're interested in that. But the Riff formulary files, these are the ones that you would request as part of your Riff package. You can request these with your Part D, your PDE data, or the plan characteristics file. And there are three different types of files, as I mentioned. There's the base or the formulary file. This is what the plan covers, and they're all Part D covered prescription drugs. There are also excluded formularies, and that's in a separate file. And these would be prescription drugs that are not covered by Part D, but the plan might cover them. They may or may not be offered under a plan's enhanced coverage. So you get information on that from the excluded drugs file. And then there's an over-the-counter file. And this, you may say, well, Part D is a prescription drug program. So why are we talking about over the counter? This isn't for drugs that you would go and buy from a retail counter. It's drugs that you would have a prescription for, but they are also available over the counter. So, and these might be even required by a plan. If they might require a step therapy, for example, you might have to try the over-the-counter drug first. And then if that works, then they wouldn't move you on to the next level. And that's why plans would have an incentive to cover those. In the Riff, all of the formulary files have this same format. And what they have to link to the PDE is the formulary ID and the formulary RX ID. You need both variables to link, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that is. The formulary ID is, the formulary. So a formulary can have multiple drugs on it. And the formulary RX ID is, how is this particular drug covered on this formulary? It also has information, again, about the tier ID, quantity limits, prior authorization, so those utilization management variables. And it links those drug characteristics variables that we talked about before. So brand name, generic name, strength, dose, or dosage form, I should say. So you have all of that information on the formulary file itself. This is what it would look like. So again, we have multiple formularies on this mocked up data. So formulary 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The same drug, so this is sorted by formulary Rx ID. The same drug is covered on each of those formularies, but depending on the formulary, it might show up on a different tier. So it might show up as a non-preferred generic in one and a preferred generic in another. These particular ones, the step variable is blank. That means it's probably the first step. They're not requiring you to try anything before you fill this prescription. There's no quantity limit for any of these, but some of the formularies require prior authorization for this in order to fill this drug, and some don't. So it's what this formulary file is telling you. And then because this is all the same drug, it's all the same formulary Rx ID, we have all the same brand name, generic name, all of that drug characteristic information. So the formulary ID is unique for each formulary, and each plan will have a single formulary, but multiple plans may share that formulary. So there's only about, in 2021, 557 formularies, but remember there's over 3,000 plans. So, and this kind of goes back to what Gia had mentioned yesterday about the pharmacy benefit managers. They're putting together the formularies for the plans, and they might put together a formulary and market it to many different plans that would pick it up as the formulary they want to use. And then we have our formulary Rx ID. This is unique for a single drug, a single brand name, strength, dosage form. Not necessarily unique to a single NDC, but definitely for a single drug. And you can find the same formulary Rx ID in different formularies. And that's why you need to use both of those pieces, formulary ID and formulary Rx ID, when you're linking to the PDE data, because you want to know for this particular fill, which formulary or how is the formulary structured for this particular fill. If you were just to merge on formulary Rx ID, you would get many values for the one PDE event that you're looking for. Again, there's a number of different formulary Rx IDs in one formulary, and the number just keeps increasing. But it's been relatively steady at 3,600, but you get more over time. And you might find that you cannot link a drug record in the PDE to the formulary file. There are a variety of reasons for this. It could be that First Data Bank or CMS can't identify the NDC code for the drug, so CCW would be unable to link it up to create that formulary Rx ID. It could be that an appeals process was generated. If this is a drug that's not normally covered by the formulary, but the beneficiary appealed and got it covered in their particular circumstance. Or what we're seeing when CCW generates this formulary file is the formulary at a point in time. And I mentioned that a drug paid for earlier in the year could possibly be deleted. Plans can change their formularies at any time. There are requirements. They do have to, if someone is taking the drug, they have to give them at least 30 days notice and make sure that they have a fill for, to get them through those 30 days. Sometimes it's that maybe a generic has become available. So the plan is going to stop covering the brand, or they're going to cover the brand at a different price. So sometimes it's that happens. Sometimes it's just a new drug that becomes available. But anyway, that's why those PUF files are available monthly. But in order to make things clean and simple, when you get the Riff formulary file, you're getting it at a point of time at the end of the year. So you could, if you wanted to check it out, you could link to the PUF files and see, or just check out the PUF files for that particular drug. Now, it's not super common that things don't link, don't have a formulary Rx ID. For a lot of things, it's these are the therapeutic classes, and they often have a formulary ID. 99.9% of the time you will find the formulary ID. For some things, which you can see are, dietary management, antacids, analgesics, those are things that you might have more often not have a formulary Rx ID. They're not covered by the formulary, perhaps, but they're showing up in the data. So for the utilization management variables that are found in the Riff formulary files. These are in the base and excluded drug files only, but this gives you that tier ID information. And Gia had talked about the tiers yesterday. The plan characteristics file has the tier file associated with it. So the tier ID is just saying which tier is the plan covering the drug on. And then whether or not prior authorization is required, whether there's a quantity limit, and then is there step therapy that applies to this drug. This information comes from the health plan management system at CMS. So that's the system that plans use to submit their benefit packages and how they're going to design their benefits to CMS. And so it's we're using an end of the year snapshot of all of this again. It gives when the Part D plan submits, they're submitting their contract and benefit package number and their formulary. And again, we have that end of the year snapshot. And the derived variables that we get sometimes from CCW, they might not be able to, again, link to these. So what might happen is that you'll see an NA if they're unable to link, or you'll see an XX. So NA would be the NDC doesn't link to the formulary. XX is it's unable to link to the plan. But depending on the year, it's about 2.5% to 8% of the PDE records that would fall into these categories where you might not be able to see what the utilization management is for that particular drug. For the tier ID values, it could be 1 to the maximum number of tiers on that plan has. If a plan is not required to submit a formulary, then the tier ID is always 1. So that would be 1 would be the maximum value for that plan. She had mentioned the types of plans that might not submit a formulary. Most plans now, almost all in this year, have 5 tiers, which would be they have a preferred generic tier, a non-preferred generic, a brand, a preferred brand, a brand, a preferred brand. They may have it, or they may call it a non-preferred brand. So they might, it used to be that they would have a preferred generic, a non-preferred generic, and a brand. But now often they've added preferred brand and non-preferred brand. And then there's that specialty tier. That's for those, really expensive drugs that plans will be, covering at a different level. You can see when we work with research data, we're often going back in time. There was a lot of shifting around in terms of how the tiers were assigned in the past, and it differed whether or not you had the standalone PDP or if you were an MAPD. So the types of benefit structures have changed over time, but now in 2023, essentially for all the plans that submit their formularies, almost like 99% of them up to 100% have a five or 6 tier structure. When we say 6 tier, you might see that in the data. The 6th tier is usually something like vaccinations that doesn't fit into those other tiers, but essentially it's a 5-tier structure. So that's in 2023, we really have kind of universally almost adopted the 5-tier structure. You can see here the number of PDE records, or the percentage of PDE records that fall into each of the tiers. It's become less common or more common to have PDE records in the in the generic tier, the preferred generic. And of course, that specialty tier is always going to be small, but it's gotten bigger over time. And then that vaccination tier is kind of just starting, but you'll see records with that possibly as well. So you get information also about prior authorization. So whether or not the plan is requiring the drug to have prior authorization. If there's a 1, that means, yes, the drug is subject to prior authorization. If there's a 0, however, it could either be that the drug is not subject to prior authorization, or the plan is not required to submit a formulary. So there's no restrictions that we can see on the drug. And about 1% to 2% of PDE records are identified as needing prior authorization. The quantity limit, if there's a 1, yes, there's a quantity limit. If it's a 0, either the drug doesn't have a quantity limit, or the plan is not required to submit. And this is much more common. You'll have, about a quarter of PDE records that are subject to some sort of quantity limit. And the plan might be doing the quantity limit as a, something about cost. It could also be something like, it's a drug that's required to have, you can only, even like there's a state regulation that says you can only have a prescription for so many doses at a time. And then there's the maximum step number value. And again, if this is missing, typically it means that there are no steps required before you fill this prescription. If it's, a step of 1, that means they want you to try something else before you try this drug. So is the quantity limit known, or is it just an indicator 1, 0? I believe it's just an indicator. I think that's all we have. I'm trying to remember though, I think we just have a 1, 0. I'll get back to you if I can find that, find something else out. So the maximum step number value, again, if it's blank, it typically means that it's not part of a step therapy group. So you can just go ahead and fill your prescription. So it's either, or it's the first step. So it's possible that you would be required to use this drug before you use something else. Or it means that the plan is not required to submit. So when you, if it's 2, that means that they're required to try at least something else. But it could be 3, which means they were required to try 2 different things before they tried this one. So it's much more common. Most are blank, meaning there's no step requirement, but some have 2, and then it's kind of less common to have a 3. And so now that was the base formulary file. The excluded drug formulary file is going to look very similar, but it's only going to include formularies with excluded drugs. But all the same variables are going to apply. You can see that it's much less common to have an excluded formulary. There's only 99 formularies that include excluded drugs, and they typically have many fewer drugs on them, maybe 7. If you want to find out if a plan is covering excluded drugs under their enhanced plan, the plan characteristics file will have a variable called excluded drugs, and that would cue you to look in the excluded drugs formulary. Now, here's something that just as we were updating slides, in 2012, the most frequent drug that was included on the excluded file was benzodiazepines. And in 2015, that switched to erectile dysfunction drugs. And the question is, why? Why such a shift? And this is something that I would encourage you to do in your own research. Definitely look by year to see if you're seeing a big shift that seems like, wow, that seems strange. Go back and check the policy, because in this case, in 2013, benzodiazepines became covered by Part D. When the program was first designed, these were seen as not great for elderly beneficiaries because they could contribute to falls or confusion. And so they were an excluded drug. But starting in 2013, now all the benzodiazepines can go onto that base formulary file, which clears the way for a different drug to be number 1. So there's a question, I think, about the this was like the step, most are blank. It's like 97% are blank. So this is the, kind of the actual values that are not blank. So just, it's step drugs are it's not the most common way of utilization management. But so anyway, just be aware when you find a big shift, go back and check policy. So, we can't necessarily know every policy that affected things on the way, but it is good to look in our data to see, is there something that we need to be aware of? Because that might change how we're looking for the drug or how we study the drug. Okay, when we're comparing the base and the excluded formulary file, for excluded, they're much more likely to have a quantity limit, but less likely to have other utilization management. And again, this is just looking at the formulary RX ID, not necessarily drugs that are being used so that we're not at the PDE level, we're at the formulary RX ID level. But and then when we look at the tiers, they're much more likely to be kind of a generic, probably tier. You don't always know that one means a certain value. That's where the tier file would come in. If you see tier equals 1, you would have to link to the tier file to know what that plan is using as the tier. But oftentimes it's the lower tiers are more generic, and 5 is the specialty tier. But I would not assume that. You do the work to make sure that that's correct. And now we have that OTC formulary file. Again, we have most of the same information, but we don't have the utilization management variables on there. And then we have the formulary RxID, brand name, generic name. And again, these are drugs that are being covered as prescription drugs. So it's something that a beneficiary would take to the prescription counter to have their prescription filled, not something that they would buy, at the retail counter. But again, if a plan wants you to try that over-the-counter drug before they're going to cover a different drug, then they need a record that you've tried it. That would come through as your prescription drug, your PDE record, your fill, I should say, to the plan. And so that's how they would get that information. And only formularies with over-the-counter drugs appear in the OTC file. And sorry, in the plan characteristics file, you would find an indicator whether or not the plan is covering over-the-counter drugs, and that would be your cue to look in the OTC file. The most frequent drugs: antihistamines, proton pump inhibitors, antifungals. So things you can buy over the counter, but you can also get a prescription for and take to the counter. There are a couple of other files that are very new that I just want to give you a little heads up on. There's an indication-based formulary. So starting in 2020, Part D plans were allowed to limit formulary inclusion of a Part D drug to only FDA-approved conditions. So in this case, they can say, we'll only cover this drug if you're using it for this condition. So we get new information on these files. The MESH CUI is a alphanumeric code that gives us information about the condition. And then we have a handy dandy label that will tell us kind of what that code is indicating. So what does that look like? Actually, since it's been available, 2021 was the first year that the indication-based formulary was available for Riff. 2022, the number of conditions actually doubled. There's still just 2 formularies that cover these. And each condition is actually only associated with one of those formularies. But if you're interested in these conditions, it might be something that you want to check out. So we have rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, anxiety, major depressive disorder, some cancers. So just something to be aware of. And then the Part D senior savings model was new in January 2021. And the first year we have a file would be January 2022. I believe I'm sorry, we have a 2021. But this program is all about insulin. So if you're interested in diabetic treatment, you perhaps want to be aware of this file. The maximum that any plan can charge if they participate in this is $35 per month. And then the copay doesn't change and this is the copay, but the copay doesn't change no matter where you are in your benefit phases. And this required the manufacturer and the plans to work together to participate, but it is a voluntary model. If you want more information on the types of insulins that are covered, there's a link there. The number of contracts that are participating is 333, almost 2,000 plans. The mean number of unique insulins per plan is 27. And then there's a copay indicator in this file as well. So you can see what the copay is that they're charging. $35 was the max, remember, but some actually have a 0 copay. 87% though are about 87% are the max $35. But you do get variables that indicate the type of insulin. So that would be like, is it in long acting, short acting? So something to be aware of if you're interested in treatment of diabetes.